Hello and welcome. Today, we're looking at incels, people who are involuntarily celibate and deal with this celibacy in an unhealthy, antisocial, and sometimes violent fashion. Since this is such a complex and serious topic, we definitely want to get the best possible opinion, so I think we should ask a Teal Deer about it. That's right, we're talking about Teal Deer.
Teal Deer. Apparently these days, incels get the bullet too. At least that's the impression that one would get reading all of the mainstream media articles attacking them relentlessly that have come out over the past few weeks since a specific van attack in Toronto, Canada. Indeed, those articles have now apparently become the myriad of citations on the incel page of Wikipedia. So because a bunch of people have asserted a load of stuff on the internet, that apparently now makes this fact, which is why apparently self-identified incels are mostly white, male, and heterosexual, and discussions on incel forums are often characterized by resentment, misanthropy, self-pity, self-loathing, misogyny, racism, a sense of entitlement to sex, and an endorsement of violence against sexually active people. And then there's the mandatory link to the Southern Poverty Law Center, as if they're an organisation that you should take seriously for some reason, as opposed to them being what they are, which is just a bunch of randomers on the internet writing stuff on a website. Basically a bunch of glorified bloggers. But apparently some people out there work under the delusion that they are some sort of authority on some things for some reasons.
Well, that's certainly an interesting take on the issue. I don't know where to begin. Well, about the SPLC. They're not a blog. They're just not. They're an organization founded by lawyers. They have lawyers working for them. They filed and won lawsuits against institutional racism, racial segregation, white supremacist groups, and more. They have an office building. They have multiple office buildings. You can't just equate that to a random, entitled millennial making stuff up on the internet. Sorry, we're supposed to be talking about incels. So, Teal Deer claims that the media coverage of incels is full of lies and vitriol. Now, I would love to tell you exactly how accurate this claim is, but I can't, because he doesn't cite any articles that supposedly have this problem beyond mentioning every single article cited by Wikipedia's incel page. And I'm not going to read 126 articles just because Teal Deer was too lazy to do his own work. Instead, I have 3 random articles that I found through Google. They don't necessarily disprove Teal Deer's claim, but at least they're, evidence that I'm going to show you that you can easily check. The first is from an outlet called Villainess, and in it the author included multiple hyperlinks to support her claims. Unfortunately, if you try clicking on the hyperlinks, you'll find that the site can't be reached, but you can still see evidence of what was written there by looking at the site address, and you can see that she wasn't lying. The second article, from Vox, doesn't even demonize incels in the first place. The tagline literally says, "I thought incels were easy to demonize, then I talked to an incel support group." Here's an entire article that is explaining why you shouldn't hate incels. Then the third article from The Guardian is all about a non-violent incel and the way he was treated by other incels for condemning a recent mass murder done by an incel. That's right, you can praise and condemn different people from the same group based on the things they did instead of the thing they call themselves. Teal Deer should try it with some other groups.
I thought it might be interesting to have a look at what incels actually are, and from there to go on and look at some of the effects that such a lifestyle would have on someone, and then some of the amusing double standards that we see when men and women are in the same position.
I have nothing bad to say about this actually, it sounds really interesting. I can't wait.
So the first question is, what is an incel? Well, it is just someone who is involuntarily celibate. That is, someone who desires a romantic relationship and yet is not in one.
Never mind, this whole discussion is screwed from the beginning because Teal Deer doesn't know what an incel is. I don't know what's worse, the fact that he doesn't realize the word isn't strictly literal, the bare minimum amount of understanding everyone will have after 5 seconds of researching incels, or the fact that he thinks a literal reading of the term involuntary celibate is someone who can't get a romantic relationship despite wanting one. This condescending bastard doesn't know what words mean.
Pretty much every person will be an involuntary celibate at some point in their lives. Most people will find themselves at some point having a day, a week, a month, a year, however long, where they want to have a romantic relationship and yet are not in one. This is actually a completely normal part of life. However, a lot of the people that you find frequenting incel forums and whatnot online, these are people for whom this process has gone on for a very extended period of time, often a number of years, in some cases decades, perhaps even the entirety of their lives. And this is why I can't understand the vitriol aimed at these people.
See, this is why understanding what you're talking about is so important. It makes sense to be outraged at anyone who would be so cruel as to demonize someone for simply talking about their loneliness online. But that's not what's happening. The criticisms aimed at incels are of those incels who are specifically misogynistic, violent, and self-destructive. The problem isn't their inceldom, it's the destructive mindset of their community.
These articles and Twitter folk and whatnot basically just declaring, well, it's all your fault. Everything that is wrong with you. You are just such a fundamentally unlikable, untouchable human. And all you need to do to fix this is to wash the Cheeto dust out of your beard, have a shower, get some decent clothes, hit the gym, and learn you some confidence. And then all of your problems will be solved, as if that is just as easy as it is.
Oh, well, if people are saying that to incels, I would agree that it's a bit much. But since I've never seen anyone talk even remotely like this anywhere, and Teal Deer hasn't cited any sources for these claims, or shown any screenshots of people saying these things, I can't say anything about these ideas, including whether or not they even exist. I do have to give Teal Deer some credit though, because even though I think his criticisms are misplaced, he is preaching a good message. He's speaking out against this tendency people have to dismiss and downplay the suffering of others as an excuse to ignore it. So, for example, he would be against the stigmatization and disregard of PTSD and trauma through the misuse of the word triggered, and he'd be against, for example, trivializing online harassment by making a video designed to mock feminists who are viciously bullied over Twitter into, say, a channel trailer that, for example, describes the act of harassing feminists as milking them for the lols. He is against these horrible things because he thinks trivializing and dismissing the suffering of others is a bad thing to do, and I commend him for that. Anyway, after this, he explains some very in-depth research he did on social isolation. It's impressive stuff, honestly. I think he has something like 10 sources for this claim. But, as impressive as it is, I'm not going to show you his research because it's, completely irrelevant. See, the research he shows us looks at the effects of social isolation in children and babies. Children and babies don't have sex, Teal Deer, you creepy f***! Other than that, he has sources he cites, but doesn't discuss that look at the effects of social isolation in older adults, middle-aged adults, and no age group in particular. But he has no research on the effects of social isolation in teenagers and young adults specifically. He has sources on every single age group except the ones he's talking about. His research is also about general social isolation. Social isolation, as in no friends, no family, no romantic relationships, but maybe other kinds of relationship. These 10 sources don't even so much as mention romantic or sexual relationships once. Not one of them. Not even the one about how rejection hurts. This has nothing to do with incels. What Teal Deer has done here is about as scientific as, I don't know, say, for example, citing a study on clover disease in male sheep as evidence for the effects of soy consumption in male humans. Stupid example, no one would ever do that. But even if I pretend his research isn't completely bunk, it's still irrelevant because none of this was in dispute in the first place. No one seriously believes that a lack of intimacy is some trivial thing with no adverse effects that shouldn't garner any sympathy. The only people who think that incels aren't legitimately suffering are in Teal Deer's head.
So with all of this out of the way, being someone who greatly desires some sort of social contact but can't have it, well, it's a terrible situation to be in. It's not healthy from a physical or a mental standpoint, and it will probably leave you feeling as if you're trapped in a cycle of never-ending despair, misery, and loneliness. But how on earth would someone end up like this anyway? Well, if the actions of what women are doing are anything to go by, you may remember the OkCupid data, which suggested that women find a staggering 80% of men to be less than average in attractiveness. Tinder fares very much the same way, where 78% of women are all fighting over the top 20% of men, leaving the bottom 80% of men to be fighting over the bottom 22% of women. The absolute runaway, unregulated nature of the sexual marketplace seems to be potentially part of the explanation.
Ah, I see. According to this totally legitimate scientific graph of scienceness and statistics, we can see that 87% of men are in romantic relationships with women. This leaves only 13% of men available for other men to date. This is heterogamy! It's clear homophobic discrimination. I am oppressed by all these men who refuse to go out with me! In all seriousness though, I have several problems with Teal Deer's data. For one, he doesn't fucking link to it. He gave us 10 useless sources to make sure we definitely agree with him about loneliness being bad, but he can't give us one citation for this? The last one isn't even a proper graph, it's just a picture of what incels think the world is like. What the fuck is wrong with you, Teal Deer?
I can't help but think there is a reason why so many societies all around the world talk about things like monogamy, talk about and generally enforce institutions such as marriage. Why it's just something so very common that societies come up with structures that encourage people to pair off one-to-one.
He thinks marriage was made to combat hypergamy? What? Clearly it doesn't work because we have marriage, but we still apparently have hypergamy. Marriage is not a magic binding spell you can use to catch women. Married women can still date other people, but he thinks they did use it. But then, what, it suddenly stopped working? And he's saying all this because of online dating data? Jesus Christ, Teal Deer, marriage has been around for thousands of years. You can't use online data as evidence of what the world was like 1,000 years ago. A few things have changed since the year 1000, like the invention of the internet. Also, hypergamy doesn't even exist, as evidenced by this diagram representing sexual relationships among students at an American high school. We can see there are both men and women with one sexual partner, two sexual partners, three sexual partners, and even 4 or 5 or more sexual partners. There are women having sex with multiple men who haven't had any other sexual partners, men having sex with multiple women who haven't had any other sexual partners, and women and men with multiple sexual partners having sex with each other. All of this in similar numbers. And while there is one male outlier with 9 different sexual partners, his sexual interactions only make up a tiny fraction of the graph, and half of his sexual partners aren't even exclusive to him. There are simply no chads to be found. Granted, this data does have some limitations, mainly that this graph was made based on a survey done in the mid-90s, and that it doesn't include data on those students with no sexual partners. But despite these limitations, it's clear that the data doesn't reflect a world where it's in the nature of women to be hypergamous, or where the 80-20 rule holds true. And looking at this, it just makes me think that it would have been nice if Teal Deer spent less time finding almost a dozen studies in support of the undisputed and bloody obvious, and a little more time researching those of his claims that are actually contentious. But then, I guess if he did that, he might actually have to change his mind sometimes.
So what has the knock-on effect of all of this been to the women who are still in the dating game while a disproportionate number of men are now out of the dating game? Well, what a surprise that over the past few years we have seen increasing numbers of articles along the lines of these ones. Women in their 30s and 40s basically screaming to the high heavens, where have all the good men gone? Because they spent their teenage years and their 20s and possibly a good chunk of their 30s relentlessly only chasing the best of the best men, turning down any and all men that they just didn't think were good enough for them. And now that their youth and fertility is spent and no one really wants them anymore, they expect men to man up and pick up all of their mistakes, rather than doing what their ancestors would have done and simply looking for Mr. Good Enough, Mr. is stable, has a job, is reliable, and I can live with him. Instead, they've been told that they can have it all. The big, massive, high-flying career, the husband who is a male model and a millionaire, and all while effortlessly juggling multiple children. Well, sorry to break the illusion, but that doesn't happen. And articles such as these are the proof that women are not happy with the situation that they have put themselves in. But of course, this is all the fault of men. They just need to man up and go and get those university degrees so that they can be good enough for those women.
Okay, let's draw up a table, and on one side we'll have whatever the fuck that was, and on the other side we'll have a look at what the articles actually say. So, we have Teal Deer complaining that women would be able to find partners if they weren't so goddamn choosy. But if we actually read the articles, we'll find they say things like, quote, "I'd reluctantly split from the man I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with," unquote, and, quote, "In my experience, a lot of men find an education a turn-off, it intimidates them, and they make assumptions," unquote. Or that there is, quote, "a dating pool that has 4 women for every 3 men, so it gives way too much leverage to those college-educated men. And I think it encourages them to be too choosy and to delay settling down." You heard it here first, folks. If men are too choosy, then that means women are too choosy. How about that? Then we have Teal Deer saying that women want too many things at once. You know, they want the ultra-successful career, the super-attractive millionaire husband, and a half-dozen children that they never have to make any sacrifices for. And I don't know how exactly I'm supposed to argue with that. It's not like the article has a paragraph saying, "Just in case an idiot accuses us of being completely unreasonable, spoiled children, please know that we're not." The article, it just doesn't say this. That's all I can say. This is just fucking bullshit. Finally, Teal Deer says that women expect men to get university degrees so they can be good enough. But if we actually read the articles, we'll find they say, quote, "I don't care whether he studied, or even whether he went to university, as long as he can keep up," unquote. And, quote, "For educated women who refuse to date non-educated men, it creates a statistical challenge because they are voluntarily limiting themselves." The word voluntary both indicating responsibility on the part of the women and that they're not fucking incels. It says it right there. They are voluntarily celibate. That's the one part of the definition of incel Teal Deer got right, and he still managed to fuck it up later. But never fear. Teal Deer has another example of a rampant female privilege, and maybe this time he'll actually read the article he chose to cite.
So what happens when women start complaining that they can't find a partner? Well, the very feminist World Health Organization will declare that you have a disability. But what a surprise, this standard will only apply to women, because it's based around failure to achieve pregnancy after 12 months or more of regular unprotected sex. Yes, the right to reproduce, which apparently includes the right to have someone to have sex with, is something that women have, but not men. When women are incels, that's a crime against humanity, and we need to do something in order to fix it.
Nope, guess not. What Teal Deer is citing as the definition of infertility is the old definition, as in, it is under review, as in this entire article is about the WHO wanting to change the definition to be different from the one he cites in order to fix the problems he is complaining about. See, the WHO is aware that the old definition of infertility excludes single men. They even went the extra step and realized it also excluded gay men and lesbians and sexually inactive women. So they changed the definition to include all these people. What the WHO meant by a suitable sexual partner, it isn't someone you like having sex with. They mean a partner who is suitable for the purposes of reproduction. As in, if a cis man is having regular unprotected sex with another cis man, they might have an amazing relationship and a great sex life and they might be really happy together, but they aren't going to get pregnant anytime soon. That man's partner is unsuitable for the purposes of reproduction. You know, the WHO isn't going around handing out sex slaves to women who don't have partners in order to solve infertility. Infertility isn't treated with sex slaves. They use fucking IVF. They're just making more people entitled to medical care. God damn it, Teal Deer, it's right there in your own article. There's no argument here. This is just an excuse to hate women and blame them for everything. How can 7,500 people think this is a good thing? Double toil and trouble. Fire, burn and cauldron bubble. Horn of deer and dead pig's ear. Sword and skull and a white man's fear. In the hell broth boil and bubble. Take us to a world of trouble. Today, we're looking at affirmative consent ads. Ads which encourage people to get verbal consent before initiating intimate and sexual contact in order to prevent accidental sexual assault. Since this is such an important and nuanced topic, we definitely want to get the best possible opinion. So, I think we should ask a Teal Deer about it.
Let's get into their content, shall we? The first video, entitled Laughing.
Whoa.
Oh, sorry. I just thought...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's going on here? We have a male character represented by the hand, we have a female character represented by the breast. So they're both laughing, presumably having a good time, and the male character makes a move romantically onto the female character that is unwanted. So you didn't get consent to do it, and this is a bad thing. Completely reasonable. Yeah? In certain circumstances, yes it is. However, this short advert here doesn't seem to address the concept of something such as social escalation. Ray Birdwhistle came along and did a lot of study around kinesics and paralanguage, and he placed face-to-face conversation at around 35% and then about 65% of communication being done non-verbally. Now, these numbers are not hard and fast. They tend to change over time, they change from study to study, but pretty conclusively, every single study across the board will always put non-verbal communication, that is pure body language communication, at somewhere between 60 and 90% of all human communication. And this is why it annoys me, and why it doesn't really seem to make so much sense that these sorts of people who talk about rape culture and the importance of consent focus so heavily, in fact, in many cases, exclusively on the verbal element.
So basically, Teal Deer has told us that body language exists. I can see he's actually researched the topic in quite a lot of depth too, way more than I would have. It's impressive. And that's why it's such a shame that all of his research was completely irrelevant. See, he talks as if Project Consent is unaware of social escalation and non-verbal communication, but they're not unaware. The entire reason they exist is to promote affirmative consent, and affirmative consent is a deliberate revolt against the idea that we should communicate consent through body language. So unless I'm misunderstanding something and it's possible to deliberately revolt against something you're unaware of, then we can safely say that Project Consent knows about body language. It's not that they were unaware, they left it out on purpose. Now, Teal Deer could argue that Project Consent is wrong to promote affirmative consent because it's unnecessary. He could, for example, demonstrate that body language is a sufficiently clear method of communicating sexual consent, or that unwanted sexual contact isn't a problem, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he begins and ends at demonstrating that body language exists, ironically condescending to us for our lack of understanding, entirely because he doesn't understand the conversation that's actually taking place. But even if he were correctly interpreting Project Consent's ideas, he'd still be wrong. See, his argument rests on conflating the idea that body language can be used to communicate consent with the idea that body language is a safe method for communicating consent, as if proving one is the same as proving the other. But anyone who's ever tried to use a wheelie chair as a stepping stool knows that this isn't the case. This oversimplification of everything crops up again later in his analysis when he looks at a clip called Whistling. Teal Deer's reading of this short is completely literal. He summarizes it as, "Don't walk up to someone and try and stick your dick in their butt." Now, I don't blame the average viewer for reading the short this way. Hell, I read the short this way to begin with. I'll admit that the message wasn't clear, but given that Teal Deer is treating Project Consent with utter contempt for the lack of understanding, he should have put some more effort into his own understanding. Stones and glass houses and all that. As it turns out, it's not that hard to figure out what Project Consent probably meant if you approach their work with a little bit of critical thinking. For example, after considering that this was made by people who are in favour of affirmative consent and against rape culture, my reading is that they're leaving out the context on purpose in order to get people to see sexual assault unfiltered by the lens of rape culture. Okay, let me put it this way. If Project Consent made a live-action ad with body language, a detailed setting, and a clear narrative, then people would use all that context to make excuses to blame the victim. I'm sorry, but they just would. For example, imagine you see a short where a woman walks into an empty room with a man and is then sexually assaulted. Knowing that context, many people would be inclined to say that the woman shouldn't have let herself be alone with him if she didn't want that to happen. While many people would argue that it's not victim blaming and they're only trying to teach women to protect themselves, what people miss is that these conversations not only begin with victim blaming, but end with victim blaming too. We say she shouldn't have let herself be alone with him, but no one ever says he shouldn't have done that to her. We behave as if the man had no part in this horrible thing that has happened. But imagine you see that short again, except the woman and the man are on a blank screen with no dialogue or action, and the man suddenly grabs the woman and sexually assaults her. When it's framed that way, you can't blame the woman. You can't tell her that she shouldn't have worn that outfit, or had that drink, or talked to that guy because you don't know what she's wearing or what she's doing. You can't even say that she shouldn't have let herself be alone, because you don't even know if she is alone. Project Consent has used complete epistemological ambivalence to make victim blaming literally impossible, since you can blame someone if you know they did something you think they ought not to, and you can blame someone if you know they didn't do something you think they ought to, but you can't blame someone if you just don't know. And in doing that, they shift the blame back onto the guilty party. Since you can't blame the victim, you have to blame the perpetrator, and once you do that, you're forced to see sexual assault and rape as what it is. A predator choosing to violate somebody.
Again, let's just remove that 60 to 90% of communication and only focus on this tiny element, which is the verbal side. And in this instance, it seems to be carrying with it the message that, oh, if you're a woman, you should be able to behave however you want and potentially drag other people into your behaviour, but to not have them respond to you as though you're performing that behaviour.
Of course, I didn't count on Teal Deer being against the condemnation of victim blaming. Okay, Teal, I agree with you that people need to be held accountable for their behaviour, especially if that behaviour harms other people, and I agree with you that people need to deal with the consequences of their actions. But what you're not understanding, Teal, is that sexual assault and rape are fucking crimes. You can't just commit a crime against someone because you don't like their behavior. Sexual assault is against the law for a bloody reason. I don't care if you think you got consent. Your ineptitude isn't a fucking excuse. If you fuck up and touch someone who doesn't want to be touched, then that's on you. No one is forcing you to touch them. That's a decision you're making based on your own stupidity. I find it extremely interesting that women are the ones who are blamed when they are sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, or raped. And when I say I find it interesting, I mean it's the most disgusting thing I've ever had the displeasure of hearing. But it is still interesting that a woman will be blamed if a man chooses to sexually assault her. Apparently, women have the utmost agency and control, and must be held to task for what they wear, how they act, and where they go. But a man is as accountable for his decision to grope or rape a woman as a fire is accountable for burning the trees. Yes, Teal Deer, I agree that people must be held accountable for their actions, especially when they drag other people into their behavior. We must hold them accountable, indeed.